There's a particular phrase that has a way of testing even the calmest adult in the room. I'm bored. Now, I've heard it said in different tones over the years, dragged out like a complaint, tossed casually like a warning, sometimes even delivered with the confidence of someone announcing a national emergency. And every time I've noticed the same instinct in adults. We rush in to fix it. We start suggesting things, offering screens, listing activities, negotiating like bored child diplomats. But here's what most people miss in that moment: boredom isn't actually the problem, it's a signal. A small, uncomfortable gap where a child is left alone with their own thoughts. And in today's world, that feels almost unfamiliar to them. I've watched this shift happen quietly over time. Children are surrounded by entertainment, yet the tolerance for stillness has become surprisingly thin. And if you've ever wondered why a child with toys, devices, and endless options still stands in front of you saying they have nothing to do, then you already know this isn't about lack of activities. It's about how their minds have learned to handle or avoid empty space. Today, I want to walk through something I've seen repeatedly: three practical approaches that don't just silence the phrase, I'm bored, but actually change what it means for a child to experience boredom in the first place. And once you understand that, you stop reacting to boredom and start using it. There's a misunderstanding many adults carry without even realizing it. The moment a child says, I'm bored, we assume our job is to immediately solve it. But over time, I noticed something interesting in how children respond when that solution always comes from outside them. The more quickly we step in, the less they learn to step out on their own. Boredom, in its simplest form, is the brain hitting a pause. Not a malfunction, more like a blank page. And what happens next depends on whether the child has learned how to write on it or expect someone else to do it for them. What often develops instead is a quiet dependency cycle. A child feels discomfort, calls out for stimulation, and the adult, wanting peace or sometimes just guilt, responds with something fast and easy: a screen, a suggestion, an activity, anything that ends the noise. It works in the moment. That's the problem, because the brain learns very quickly discomfort does not need to be tolerated, it needs to be replaced. And the replacement is usually something high dopamine, instant, and external. Over time, this shapes attention itself, not in dramatic ways, but in subtle ones. A child who once could sit and imagine now needs constant switching. A child who once invented games now waits to be entertained. It's not laziness, it's conditioning. And this is where many parents unknowingly get trapped in what I call the entertainment reflex. The child says they are bored, and the adult becomes the solution provider instead of the guide. But boredom was never meant to be eliminated, it was meant to be navigated. And when it's constantly removed too quickly, something important gets delayed in development: the ability to generate internal motivation. Now, the first shift I always recommend is uncomfortable at first, but it works because it does something most modern environments avoid. It removes the escape hatch. I call it the boredom reset. It sounds simple, almost too simple, but the idea is to deliberately allow short, structured periods where nothing is provided. No suggestions, no rescuing, no, here, take this, and importantly, no screens filling the gap. At first, children don't respond to this calmly. There's usually resistance. They repeat the complaint. They escalate it. Sometimes they'll even claim everything is too boring or act like the world has temporarily lost meaning. That reaction is not dramatic. It's transitional. What's happening underneath is the brain adjusting to the absence of constant external stimulation. For many children today, silence or emptiness is unfamiliar territory, so the nervous system initially treats it like something is missing rather than something is opening. But if the adult holds steady and doesn't rush in, something important begins to happen. After a few minutes, sometimes longer depending on age, you start to see small shifts. A child might pick up an object without purpose. They might start pacing, building, drawing, talking to themselves. This is the key moment most adults interrupt too early. Because what looks like doing nothing is actually the brain switching gears from passive reception to internal generation. That is the foundation of creativity. In psychology terms, this is where the default mode network becomes active. The system responsible for imagination, memory integration, and self directed thought. It only fully engages when external input drops. And that's the irony. Boredom is not empty space, it's creative space that hasn't been trained yet. The reset works best when it's predictable. Not punishment, not abandonment, just a normal part of the day where the child learns, I don't need constant input to function. Over time, something subtle changes. The complaint doesn't disappear overnight, but it becomes less urgent. And more importantly, the child starts trying before asking. That shift alone is where real independence begins. The second solution is where things start to feel less like managing boredom and more like quietly redesigning the entire environment a child operates in. Most adults respond to boredom in a reactive way. A child complains, and we search for something new to fix it. But what I began to notice over time is that boredom is often not a child problem. It's an environment problem that hasn't been structured for independent engagement. So instead of constantly supplying entertainment, the goal becomes something more strategic. Build an environment that invites action without requiring permission. I call this environmental design over entertainment delivery. It starts with a simple shift in mindset. A child does not need endless options. In fact, too many options often create paralysis. What they need is a small, reliable set of always available activities that don't depend on an adult stepping in. This could be as simple as a visible rotation of activities, drawing materials in one place, puzzles or building objects in another, books in a reachable spot, even basic household objects that can be repurposed into play. The key is not complexity, it's accessibility. Because when everything is hidden, locked, or requires asking, the child learns that action depends on approval. But when tools are visible and reachable, the environment quietly communicates something else. You can start without me. Another important layer is novelty rotation. Children don't lose interest because they are incapable of focus. They lose interest because stimulation becomes predictable. So instead of introducing new things constantly, a small rotation of existing materials keeps curiosity alive without overstimulation. Now, here's the subtle psychological effect. When a child enters a room and sees multiple possible actions already available, the brain shifts from I am bored to what do I choose first? That small internal question is a major developmental milestone. It marks the transition from external dependence to internal decision making. There's also something deeper happening here. When children repeatedly find ways to engage themselves in their environment, they begin building what psychologists call self efficacy, the belief that I can figure things out on my own. And that belief is far more powerful than any single activity you could ever hand them. Over time, the complaint of boredom doesn't disappear because you argued with it or distracted it away. It fades because the environment stops rewarding helplessness and starts rewarding exploration. And that's when you begin to notice something interesting. The child stops waiting for life to entertain them and starts interacting with it. The third solution is where everything starts to lock into place, because this is no longer about managing boredom at all. It's about redefining what a child believes their role is when nothing is actively entertaining them. And this is the part many adults unintentionally avoid because it requires a shift in identity for the child, from being entertained to being responsible for initiating action. I often tell it this way: boredom doesn't disappear by filling time, it disappears when time becomes owned. When a child is used to being rescued from boredom, they develop a quiet expectation that stimulation is something delivered to them. But when that pattern is interrupted consistently, something more mature begins to form, the understanding that they can produce movement in their own environment. This is where responsibility becomes a tool, not a punishment. Now, I'm not talking about overwhelming tasks or rigid discipline systems. I'm talking about small, age appropriate responsibilities that quietly anchor the child into action, things that require initiation, not just obedience. Because psychologically, responsibility forces a different kind of thinking. Instead of asking, "What will entertain me?" the brain starts asking, "What needs to be done here?" or even, "What can I improve right now?" That shift is subtle, but it's powerful. I've observed that when children are given consistent, manageable responsibilities, things they can complete without constant supervision, they begin to build what psychologists refer to as intrinsic motivation. In simple terms, they start doing things because they feel capable, not because someone is pushing them. And here's where boredom starts to lose its grip entirely. A child who understands that they can act on their environment doesn't sit in that passive waiting state for long. They may still experience boredom, but it no longer feels like a dead end. It becomes a trigger. There's also a secondary effect that's often overlooked. Responsibility builds identity. A child who regularly contributes in small ways begins to see themselves differently, not as someone who needs entertainment, but as someone who participates. And participation changes everything. Even something as simple as being trusted to organize, clean up, plan, or maintain a small personal project creates a feedback loop. Action leads to result leads to recognition, and recognition reinforces action. Over time, this replaces the boredom complaint with something more productive, not necessarily excitement, but direction. And direction is what most children are actually missing when they say, "I'm bored." Because once a child learns that they are not waiting for life to happen to them, but actively shaping what happens next, boredom stops being a problem to solve and starts becoming a moment they know exactly how to move through. Now, if you followed all three solutions closely, you'll notice something important. None of them are about eliminating boredom. That was never the real goal. What we've actually been doing is changing the child's relationship with discomfort, silence, and unstructured time. Because "I'm bored" is rarely about having nothing to do. It's about not yet knowing how to start. And once that understanding clicks, the entire dynamic in the home shifts. The board and reset teaches the brain that stillness is safe, not something to escape immediately. The environment design teaches that options already exist without constant adult intervention. And responsibility teaches something even deeper, that action can originate from within. Put together, these three approaches quietly rewire the pattern. Instead of "I'm bored," right pointing arrow, someone fixes it, it becomes "I'm bored," right pointing arrow, I can figure this out. That's not just a behavioral change, that's a developmental one. And what many adults don't realize is that children don't actually need more entertainment, they need more tolerance for initiation, the ability to begin something without emotional resistance. Because in real life, motivation doesn't always arrive first. Often, action has to come before motivation shows up. Now, I won't pretend this transition is instant. At the beginning, you'll still hear the complaint. You may even feel like nothing is changing. But underneath that surface, the brain is adjusting to a new operating system. Less dependency, more initiation. Less waiting, more doing. And slowly, something shifts in tone. The phrase "I'm bored" becomes less of a demand and more of a passing observation. Sometimes it disappears entirely, not because boredom was removed, but because it lost its authority. And that's really the point. Before I wrap this up, I want to hear from you because every parent and caregiver has their own version of this story. How do the children around you react when boredom hits? And have you noticed any patterns that surprised you? Drop it in the comments. I do read them and I often respond when I can. If this helped you rethink something as simple but powerful as boredom, then make sure you like, share, and subscribe. We're building a space where parenting isn't guesswork, but understanding.